All right, so let's dive into useContext.
Okay.
It's a React hook.
Hmm.
And, React hooks are these functions that let us use React features
Right.
from our functional components.
Yeah.
And useContext is all about managing data
Yes.
in a really nice way,
It is.
especially if you've wrestled with passing data down
Oh, yeah.
through like a deep component tree.
I've been there.
It gets messy.
It's
It's very messy.
It's like trying to get a package delivered to a friend who lives in a building
Oh.
with no elevator.
Oh my God.
100 flights of stairs.
You'll get there eventually.
You'll get there eventually.
But it's going to take a lot of effort.
So much effort.
So much effort.
Yeah, and useContext is like,
Yeah.
hold on, there's a better way.
There's a better way.
Haircut.
Yeah, it's like a shortcut.
How does it work?
Well, we use this function called createContext to set up the context.
Right.
And think of it like creating a blueprint for the data.
That you want to share.
Got it.
Like a user's language preference.
Yeah.
And it can even have like a default value.
And so createContext sets the stage.
Yes.
And then useContext is how our components actually access that data.
Precisely.
That data.
Yes.
Okay.
So let's say you have like a language context.
Okay.
Use createContext to define it.
Right.
Maybe set English as the default.
Okay.
Then you wrap the parts of your application that need access to that language preference with the provider component.
Okay, so the provider's saying, hey, all you components in my realm.
Exactly.
Here's the language.
That's a great way to put it.
That we're using.
Yep.
And any component inside this provider can now use the useContext hook to grab that language preference.
Directly.
Directly.
No matter how deep down the tree it is.
Doesn't matter how deep.
Wow. That's so much cleaner than passing props down through every level.
For sure.
So in our example, like
that button deep inside our app can just use context to get the language.
Exactly.
As simple as that.
Simple as that.
So what happens if we need to change the language?
Oh, that's a great question.
The user switches from English to Spanish.
Yeah. What do we do then?
I'm guessing useContext doesn't handle actually updating the data.
You're right.
Okay. It doesn't.
It just grabs it.
It just accesses it.
Okay.
So for that,
we
need to bring in our friend useState.
Oh, yeah. Good old useState.
We can use useState to track the current language.
All right.
And then pass that as the value to our language context provider.
Got it. So when the user changes the language, we update the state with useState.
Exactly.
And that state is connected to the provider.
Yep.
So boom, the language updates across the app.
Exactly.
Nice.
And all the components using that language context will re-render to reflect the change.
What about components?
Ooh, good question.
That are outside of any provider for that context.
Do they just crash and burn?
No, they don't crash and burn.
Okay.
You remember that default value we set in createContext?
Yeah.
That acts as a safety net.
Okay.
So if a component tries to use useContext outside of a provider, it will gracefully fall back to that default value.
That's a relief.
It is a relief.
It's like a backup generator if the main power goes out.
I like that analogy.
And this default value is really handy for testing, too.
Yes, very handy.
We don't have to set up the whole complex provider structure in our tests.
Yeah, the default value just keeps things nice and simple.
Okay, so we have default values. We have providers distributing data.
Yep.
Is there any way to override a context value for just a specific part of the app?
Yes.
Okay.
That's where it gets even more interesting.
Okay.
We can nest providers.
What?
Yes. So we could wrap our welcome message component in its own language context provider.
Yeah.
But with a different language value.
So it would use that language from that provider.
Yes.
Even if a parent provider is supplying a different language to the rest of the application.
You got it. That's awesome. Yeah. It's very powerful.
That's starting to get really powerful.
Yeah.
But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, I think we should talk a bit about performance.
That's a good point.
Because there are performance implications.
Yes. Especially as our applications grow.
Right.
Our component trees get more complex.
Yeah.
We do need to be mindful of performance.
So what are some things we should be watching out for?
Okay, so let's say we are passing like a complex object or a function as our context value.
Yeah.
Each time a component re-renders, React needs to figure out if anything has changed with simple values like numbers or strings. That's easy.
It can tell.
Yeah. But with objects and functions, it can get a little tricky.
Because even if the actual data inside an object hasn't changed,
yes,
if we create a new object reference, React might think it's a new value.
Exactly.
Okay.
And trigger all these re-renders.
Unnecessary re-renders.
Yes, unnecessary re-renders.
Yeah.
And that can really slow things down.
Especially if we have a lot of components relying on that context.
Yep. So what do we do?
Well, luckily, React gives us some tools to help us combat this.
I have a feeling you're about to introduce.
I am.
useMemo and useCallback.
You read my mind.
Our performance superheroes.
Yes.
So useMemo is like a master optimizer.
It is.
For expensive calculations or creating complex objects.
Yes. It helps us avoid doing work if the data hasn't actually changed.
Okay.
And useCallback is great for optimizing functions.
So in our language example, we could use useMemo to wrap the creation of our language object.
Yes, you could.
So React would only create a new one.
If the language itself changes?
Exactly.
Otherwise, it would reuse the existing object.
Exactly. And that can make a big difference.
Yeah, prevent those cascading re-renders.
Yes.
That can slow things down.
Yes, very good.
So useContext gives us this awesome way to share data globally.
Yes.
But we need to be mindful
of
how we structure our code.
For sure.
To avoid performance pitfalls.
Yes.
But now I'm curious about...
What about those pitfalls?
Those pitfalls.
We're going to dive into those next.
Okay. So I've definitely had those moments where I'm like staring at my code.
Oh, yeah.
Convinced everything is set up right. But the context value just refuses to show up.
It's like, it's just not there.
Where it should. It's so frustrating.
Oh, yeah. Those useContext mysteries.
Yeah.
They can be tricky.
It really is.
But often they boil down to a few common pitfalls.
Okay.
One of the most frequent ones is trying to use useContext in the same component where you're providing the context.
Oh.
Or even below it.
Oh, okay.
In the component tree.
So it's like trying to... It's like read a page before it's been written.
Exactly. And look,
it's a great analogy.
You're just going to end up with a blank stare.
Yeah. The provider needs to be higher up in the hierarchy, acting like a distributor.
Makes sense.
So that the value is accessible to everything beneath it.
What other common gotchas?
Sometimes it's as simple as forgetting to wrap the relevant part of your application with the provider.
Okay.
Or misplacing it within the component tree.
Got it. So being mindful of the provider placement is key.
It is key.
Okay. Any tips for debugging these kinds of issues?
React DevTools is our best friend here.
Oh, yeah.
It lets us visually inspect the component tree.
Like an architect examining blueprints?
Yes, and see which components have access to which context values.
So we can actually see the context flowing through our app?
That's so helpful. It is.
Are there any other issues that can cause context headaches?
Definitely. You might encounter build issues. If you're working with symlinks in your project.
Symlinks.
Yeah.
Okay, so symlinks for people who maybe aren't familiar.
Yeah, symlinks are like shortcuts. That point to files or folders in different locations.
Got it.
They can really streamline development. But sometimes they can lead to situations where React treats the some context you're using to provide the context. And the some context you're using to read it is two different things.
Really?
Even though
they look the same.
They look identical in your code.
Wow.
It's all about how the build process handles those symlinks. And it can create duplicate modules.
Right.
And when that happens with your context objects, React gets confused.
So for useContext to work seamlessly, the some context used for providing and reading must be the exact same object. The same object.
Not just lookalikes.
Not just similar.
But like identical.
Identical twins.
Identical twins.
Yes.
Okay.
And that's why build issues related to some links can be especially tricky to track down.
Yeah.
But speaking of tricky. There's another useContext mystery.
Oh, boy.
That can really cause some head scratching.
Okay, what is that?
The dreaded undefined context value problem.
Oh, yeah. But if we set a default value in tree context, shouldn't that kick in?
You would think.
If there's no provider.
You would think.
Right.
But this issue arises when you actually have a provider.
Okay.
But it's passing a value of undefined.
So the provider is there?
It's there.
But it's like offering an empty bag of chips.
Exactly.
What causes that?
Often it's an oversight.
Okay.
Developers might forget to include that crucial value prop.
On the provider.
On the provider.
Or use a different prop name.
Or use a different prop name.
Yeah, I can see myself doing that.
It happens.
Like a typo,
yeah.
Deep in the code.
Yeah, and luckily React is pretty good
okay.
at catching these kinds of mistakes.
Okay.
And it'll often issue console warnings if you've missed the value prop.
So React is like our helpful coding buddy.
It is.
Giving us warnings.
Yes.
So aside from those warnings, what's the best way to avoid this?
Double checking your code.
All right.
Making sure you're passing that value prop correctly.
Okay.
It's always a good practice.
So we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
From like the inner workings of useContext to all the pitfalls.
All the pitfalls.
That can trip us up.
Yeah,
So far we've learned useContext is this powerful tool
it is.
For managing shared data in React.
Yes,
especially when we have components nested several levels deep.
Deeply nested.
Yeah, it avoids the headache of prop drilling.
It
streamlines our code.
Streamlines it significantly.
But like any powerful tool,
yes,
it requires careful handling.
It does.
We need to be mindful of how we structure.
For sure.
Our providers and our code.
Yes, and how we handle updates.
And how we optimize for performance.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now shifting gears a bit.
Yeah. So I'm curious about like using useContext a lot in a large application.
Yeah.
Could it make managing dependencies harder?
Yeah, that's a good point.
And understanding the data flow?
Right, because it's
that's like challenging.
It's like building a complex network of roads. And you have all these shortcuts.
Yeah.
It might be convenient at first.
Right.
But eventually it gets really hard to navigate.
You don't know where you are.
Yeah, and you don't understand the flow of traffic.
Yeah, like how things are connected.
Right. And relying heavily on context can lead to similar challenges in large applications.
Yeah.
Because it can be hard to trace the path of data.
Right, and understand how changes in one part of the app might affect other parts.
Yeah, it becomes more complex.
So it's not just about avoiding performance pitfalls. It's not just about that.
At the component level,
right,
but also thinking about the overall architecture.
Yes, the maintainability of our application.
Okay, so what does this all mean?
Good question.
For our listeners who are eager to start using useContext.
I think the key takeaway here is that useContext is a powerful tool.
Mm-hmm.
But like any tool, it has its ideal use cases.
Right.
It's not a one-size-fits-all.
For state management.
For state management in React.
So sometimes a more structured approach.
Yes.
Using a dedicated state management library might be a better fit.
Might be a better choice.
So it's about choosing the right tool for the job.
Exactly.
Considering the size.
The size of our application.
The complexity.
The type of data we're managing.
The type of data.
How we want to handle updates and data flow.
Very good.
I think we provided our listeners with a lot to think about today.
We have.
We've really demystified useContext.
I think so.
Explored its strengths. Shed some light on those potential pitfalls.
We did.
To watch out for. So hopefully our listeners feel empowered to use this tool.
Yes, confidently.
And maybe this deep dive has sparked some new ideas.
Well, I hope so.
Inspired them to explore even more advanced use cases.
Yeah, there's always something new to learn.
There is.
In the world of React.
It's always evolving.
Always.
Well, this has been a fantastic deep dive into useContext.
It has.
Thanks for joining us on this journey.
It's been a pleasure.
Of exploration and discovery.
Absolutely.
And to all our listeners out there.
Yes.
Keep experimenting.
Keep learning.
Keep diving deep.
Yes.
Into the fascinating world of React.
Absolutely.
See you next